truck bed was our whole world for what felt like a week, just this grinding, bone-jarring ride that never seemed to end. The smell, that's what I remember most from that first leg, this thick soup of damp wool uniforms, cheap tobacco smoke, and the sharp tang of men's sweat, a smell that was part fear and part just being crammed together like cattle. The veterans, the guys who'd been out here before getting pulled back for a rest, they were the worst part. They didn't say a word, not a blessed word. They just stared at nothing, their faces grey and empty, not even looking at us replacements, not wanting to see our fresh, scrubbed faces that reminded them of what they used to be. I was just a kid, 18 years old, and clutching my K98 like a security blanket, the same model my father carried in the mud of Flanders. I kept running my thumb over the stock, wondering if his hands had sweat on this same spot, if he felt this same cold knot in his gut on his way to the front. I was trying so hard to find his courage in that wood grain, to feel some kind of connection to the man who'd come home quiet but whole, hoping I had it in me to do the same. And the world outside kept changing as we rumbled east. It started out almost normal, peaceful even, villages with smoke curling from chimneys and farmers in their fields, and for a minute you could almost forget what we were heading into. But then the villages got quieter, the windows boarded up, and then they just stopped. Replaced by shattered skeletons of houses, blackened timbers sticking up like broken ribs. The trees went from green to splintered toothpicks. The ground turned into a pockmarked mess of craters, some filled with oily water. It was like driving into a photograph of the moon, a dead landscape where nothing could possibly live. That feeling of dread, it wasn't a sudden thing. It was a slow, cold weight that settled in my chest with every mile, growing heavier than the pack on my back. You didn't need to be told you were in hell's backyard. You could see it, smell it in the air, this foul mix of cordite and something rotten, something you didn't want to put a name to. Then I heard it. At first it was just a sound on the wind, distant and faint over the grumble of the truck's engine. I couldn't place it, didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't a boom or a thump like our own artillery we'd hear sometimes. This was different. It was a ripping sound, like a giant, angry man tearing a massive sheet of canvas, but so fast, impossibly fast, a metallic brrrrrp that lasted a few seconds and then stopped, only to start up again from a different direction. It was unnerving, that sound. It had a personality to it, a kind of hungry urgency. I remember leaning over to this corporal sitting next to me, a guy who hadn't said a word the whole trip, his collar tabs showing the kind of experience I couldn't even imagine. I asked him, trying to sound casual, "What is that noise?" He turned his head slowly, and the look in his eyes wasn't anger or annoyance. It was just a flat, bottomless exhaustion. He didn't even blink. "That," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "is the Hitler sedge, boy, the Hitler's saw. You'll learn that sound. It'll be the last thing a lot of you new fish hear." Then he turned back to staring at the floorboards. The Hitler's saw. The name itself sent a chill right through me. And just like that, everything from training marching, the rifle drills, the mock assaults on pretend hillsall of it evaporated. It felt like I'd been playing with toy soldiers, and now I was hearing the noise of the real thing, and it made me feel like a child, useless and hopelessly far from home. We finally got off the trucks a few miles back and marched the rest of the way, the sound of the saw getting louder, more frequent, like a constant, angry heartbeat throbbing across the whole front. We were sent up to a sector they called a quiet zone, which just meant they weren't trying to kill all of us, all the time. My squad was assigned to dig in near what was left of a farmhouse, just a pile of rubble with one wall stubbornly standing. The ground was cold and hard, and with every thrust of the entrenching tool, I expected to hear that ripping sound. We were sweating despite the chill, the kind of cold sweat that comes from fear, not exertion. And then it happened. The sound wasn't distant anymore. It was right there, so close it wasn't just a sound you heard. It was a physical force that hit you in the chest. Brrrrrrrrp. It came from across the field, and I heard the rounds snapping overhead, this vicious crack-crack-crack as they broke the sound barrier right by our ears. I didn't think, I didn't reason. There was no time for any of that. It was pure, raw instinct. I threw myself flat into the half-dug hole, pressing my body into the cold, greasy mud as if I could somehow push myself through it, become part of the earth, become invisible. I could feel the vibration of the bursts through the ground. Chips of stone and wood were flying off the farmhouse wall, peppering the air. I squeezed my eyes shut, my face buried in the dirt, my whole body trembling so hard I thought my bones would shake apart. This was the fear, the kind they can't train you for, the kind that empties your mind of everything except the absolute primal need to not be. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to open my eyes, my cheek still pressed into the mud. I saw the veterans, the same silent men from the truck. They weren't panicking. They were up on the firing step of the trench line, calmly returning fire, shouting ranges to each other, their movements economical and practiced. One of them, an old sergeant with a face like leather, glanced back at me, not with contempt, but with a kind of weary understanding. And that's when the shame washed over me, hot and sharp, worse than the fear. I was supposed to be a soldier, and here I was, a terrified boy hugging the dirt. That first encounter, that first time the saw truly aimed in my direction, changed everything. I learned right then that the MG42 wasn't just another weapon like my rifle or a mortar. It was a presence, a living, breathing monster on the battlefield. It dictated the terms of your existence. It told you when you could move, when you had to keep your head down, where you could take a breath that wasn't a shallow gasp. It owned the ground between the lines. A single MG42, well-placed with a good crew, could hold up a whole company. You'd see it happen, see men pinned down in a field, trying to become one with the earth just like I had, while that screaming saw just chewed up the landscape around them. You learned to listen to it, to read its voice. A long, sustained burst meant it was hosing an area, and you might have a second to dash between craters. Short, controlled bursts, BRRP, 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 that was a seasoned crew, picking their targets, and that was even more dangerous. You learned that the sound was flatter, more of a crack when it was aimed directly at you, and more of a rumble when it was engaging targets to your flank. It became the soundtrack of our lives, a constant reminder that death was just a trigger pull away. And that's when I understood what my real best friend was. It wasn't my rifle, though I kept it clean and relied on it. It wasn't even the other guys in my squad, though God knows we kept each other sane. My best friend, my only real friend that could save my life, was the dirt. It was the depth of my foxhole, the solidity of a stone wall, the cover of a crater. It was the blessed darkness of night, when the saw's eyes were blinded, and we could move, resupply, maybe even snatch a few minutes of sleep that wasn't just exhausted unconsciousness. We'd whisper to each other in the dark, voices hushed, talking about home, about girls, about the food we missed, anything but the war. That's where the friendships were forged, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, shared misery of a muddy hole, passing a cigarette back and forth, the glow of the ember carefully cupped in a hand. We had our dark jokes, calling THE Chinese letter, the front, the asshole of the world, and saying the only thing the Russians had more of than soldiers was winter. We'd get parcels from home, sometimes with cookies that had turned to crumbs or sausage that had gone green, but we'd share every last bit. That homesickness was a physical ache, a longing for something pure and simple, a world where the loudest sound was your mother calling you for dinner, not the scream of the saw. Courage, I learned, wasn't what I thought it was back in training. It wasn't about not being afraid. I was always afraid, every minute of every day. The fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in my belly. Real courage was something else entirely. It was the ability, somehow, to stand up and do your job while you were absolutely consumed by that fear. It was the corporal who'd have to rise up and spot for the MG crew, knowing he was drawing fire. It was the runner who had to leave the safety of his hole and sprint across open ground with a message, the rounds kicking up dirt at his heels. It was the medic, a guy we called Dark, who was probably just a farmer's son from Bavaria, who'd scramble out to drag a wounded man back while that terrible ripping sound tried to find him. They weren't fearless. You could see the terror in their eyes, but they moved. They functioned. That first day, that baptism by fire from the saw, it redefined everything for me. It stripped away any boyish ideas of glory and left behind the raw, gritty truth of survival. It was about the man next to you, and doing your part so that maybe, just maybe, you'd all see tomorrow. The MG42 was the worst enemy any of us could imagine, a mechanical horror that tested the very limits of a man's soul. But in a twisted way, it also taught us what we were made of, forged a bond between us that only men who have faced that kind of terror can understand. It was the worst enemy, and the teacher of the hardest lessons I'd ever learn. I still hear it sometimes in my dreams, that ripping sound, and I can still feel the cold mud on my face, and I remember the boy I was, and the man I had to become, all because of the screaming saw. You want to know what it was really like? Not the newsreels, not the history books. You want to know about the MG42? Sure, I'll tell you about the MG42. We called it the Nachensage, the bone saw. The name tells you everything, doesn't it? But that name, that's just the sound it made to the poor bastards on the other end. For me, for the man who had to feed it, carry it, clean it, and sleep with it curled up next to him in a muddy hole, it was something else entirely. It was my best friend and my worst enemy, sometimes in the same minute. It was like being chained to a dragon, a beautiful, terrifying dragon that breathed fire and kept the wolves at bay. But you knew, deep down, that its hunger might consume you too. It started with the weight. Not just the weight of the gun itself, which was a solid chunk of steel about 12 kilos, but the weight of the whole damn thing. You never just carried the gun. You carried the lafette, the tripod. There was another 20 kilos of dead weight that would dig into your shoulder until you had a permanent bruise that was every shade of purple and yellow. And then the ammunition. Oh, God, the ammunition. A 50-round belt wasn't so bad, but you'd have to carry them linked together, 250 rounds at a time, draped over your neck and shoulders like some kind of suicidal priest wearing vestments made of lead. You'd start a march with 100 pounds on you, easy. The ache in your shoulders became a part of you, a constant companion, like your heartbeat or the taste of fear in the back of your throat. But the heaviest weight wasn't the metal. It was the looks from the other men in the squad. The new replacements would look at you with a kind of awe, this guy who operates the big gun. The veterans, the old hares who'd been in Russia since 41, they looked at you with something else. Respect, sure, but also pity. Because they all knew. In any firefight, I was the primary target. The enemy officers would tell their men, find the machine gun. Every rifleman, every mortar crew, every sniper's scope was looking for the guy with the long barrel, the guy with the ammo belts. That look in their eyes, it was the heaviest weight of all. It was like they were already saying goodbye. And the smell, I can still smell it. That sharp, metallic, oily scent of the gun. It got into your clothes, your hair, your skin. No matter how much you washed, if such a thing was even possible, that smell was on you. It was the smell of my job. Cleaning it was a ritual, a prayer for survival. After every action, rain or shine, exhausted or not, you cleaned it. You'd sit there with your pull-through cord and your patches, the oily rag in your hand, working the bore until it shone, checking the recoil booster, the bolt. It had to be perfect. A jam at the wrong moment, and it wasn't just your life, it was the whole section's life. So you'd sit there, obsessing over it, your fingers black with grease and powder residue, and it felt like you were tending to a living thing. A temperamental, deadly guard that demanded constant sacrifice. That smell of hot solvent and hot metal is more a memory of the war to me than the smell of cordite or mud. Then there was the fire. You don't hear an MG42. You experience it. When you pulled the trigger, the world ended. It wasn't a rat-a-tat-tat like the American Brownings. No, it was a tearing sound, a ripping canvas sound, a high-pitched brrrrrrrrrrpt that was so fast the individual shots blurred into one continuous, deafening roar. The vibration started in your hands, traveled up your arms, and shook your whole body. Your teeth would rattle. You'd feel it in your bones. Spent brass casings would spew out of the ejection port like a fountain of golden snakes, piling up around your feet, hot and shimmering. The air around you would get hazy with the smoke and the smell of burnt powder. And in the middle of that chaos, there was this strange, terrible feeling of control. The world is falling apart. Bullets are snapping past your head. Men are screaming, but you have this power. You can answer back. You can lay down a wall of lead that can stop a charge, that can pin down a whole platoon. You're the rock, the anchor. For a few seconds, you're not a scared kid from Hamburg. You're a giant holding back the tide. It's a powerful feeling, a drug. You feel indispensable, but the high never lasts. The moment you let off the trigger, the silence rushes in, and it's almost louder than the gun itself. And with the silence comes the guilt. It always came. You'd see the tracer rounds. Every fifth round was a tracer, arcing out into the darkness, into a tree line, and you'd know they weren't just hitting dirt. You'd think, somewhere in some village in Russia or France, a mother is going to get a telegram. A wife will become a widow. A kid will grow up without a father. And you did that. Your finger did that. You look at the empty brass at your feet, hundreds of them, and each one was a message you sent. It's a sickening feeling. You try not to think about it. You make a joke, you light a cigarette with shaking hands, you check the gun again. You do anything to push that thought away. We all did. Dark humor was our armor. My loader, France, he was good for that. After a long burst, he'd slap me on the helmet and say, "Careful, Klaus, you'll wear out the barrel. The quartermaster will have our hides if we need another one." And we'd laugh, a harsh, barking laugh that had no joy in it, but it was better than thinking. France. He was a big, cheerful kid from a farm in Bavaria, strong as an ox, with hands like slabs of meat, perfect for handling the hot barrel and feeding the belts smoothly. He was my loader for 8 months. We had a rhythm, a dance. I'd be on the gun, my world narrowed to the sights and the target. He'd be beside me, his body curled around the ammo box, his hand guiding the belt, his voice in my ear telling me what he saw when to shift fire. We'd share a canteen, a piece of black bread, a damp cigarette. You get closer to a man in a foxhole than you ever do to anyone else. You know how he smells when he's scared, the sound of his breathing when he's trying to sleep. He was my best friend in that damned war. Then outside of some ruined village in Ukraine, the mortars started. They always found us first. The enemy knew. The first rounds walked their way towards our position, the crumps getting closer, the concussive blasts feeling like a giant was pounding the earth with his fist. Dirt and shrapnel whistled through the air. I was hugging the ground, my face in the mud, waiting for the barrage to lift. France was right next to me. The mortars stopped as suddenly as they started, and in that eerie quiet, we knew what was coming. The infantry assault. I got up on the gun, my hands finding the grips by instinct. "Belts!" I yelled to France. I heard the familiar clatter of him slotting a new one in. Then I heard a different sound, a sharp, wet crack like a rock hitting a melon, and a short, guttural cry that was cut off almost before it started. I turned my head. France was looking at me, his eyes wide with surprise. There was a small, neat hole right in the center of his forehead. A sniper. He just slumped over, his body blocking the ammo feed. The silence after his cry was the most shocking sound I've ever heard. For a second I just stared. Then the Russian shouts started, getting closer. There was no time for grief, no time for anything. I had to shove his body aside, my hands leaving bloody prints on his tunic, to get to the gun. I had to keep firing. I fired until the barrel glowed cherry red and the Russians pulled back. I fired with tears streaming down my face, mixing with the sweat and the grit. That's the unspoken rule, you see. The gun must survive. The gun is more important than the gunner. France was expendable. I was expendable. The gun was not. You have to accept that cold, hard fact or you'll go mad. That's the hate part of the relationship. It demands everything. It demands your strength, your sanity, your friends. It paints a target on your back that every enemy soldier for 1,000 meters can see. It isolates you. You're the machine gunner. You're different. But then there's the love. As much as I hated it, I loved that gun. It was my world. In the middle of all the chaos and the fear and the loss, it was the one thing I could depend on. I knew its moods better than I knew my own. I knew if the cyclic rate was a little off just by the sound. I knew how to adjust the sights for the wind by feel. I knew exactly how many bursts I could fire before the barrel needed changing. It was my purpose. Without it, I was just another lancer, another grunt with a rifle. With it, I was somebody. It kept me alive. It was the only thing standing between me and the hordes coming out of the steppe. I talked to it sometimes, late at night on watch. "Just a little longer, old girl," I'd whisper, running my hand along the cool metal of the receiver. "Just get us through this one." It felt more real, more reliable than the memory of my family back home. Home was a dream, a faded photograph. The MG42 was the cold, hard reality. The end came during the big retreat west in '44. It was chaos. The front had collapsed. We were a ragged group of maybe 20 men, surrounded on 3 sides, falling back through a frozen forest. We were almost out of ammunition. I had one last belt. The gun was hot. The barrel was shot out. We could hear the T-34s crashing through the trees behind us, their engines sounding like monstrous beasts. Our lieutenant, a kid who'd been in charge for all of 2 weeks, pulled me aside. His face was pale. "Klaus," he said, his voice cracking. "We can't carry it. It's over. You know what to do." I did know. Every gunner knew the final drill. You take the bolt. You throw it as far as you can into the woods. You smash the sight. You bend the barrel if you can. You render the weapon useless so the enemy can't turn it against your own boys. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the receiver. This thing that had been my life, my burden, my companion for 3 years. It had saved me a dozen times over. It had cost me France. It had defined me. And now I had to kill it. It felt like murder. It felt like betrayal. My hands were shaking as I field stripped it, pulling out the vital parts. The bolt, heavy and intricately machined, felt like a piece of my own heart. I drew my arm back and hurled it into a thicket, hearing it disappear into the undergrowth with a final, pathetic clatter. I took my entrenching tool and smashed the delicate rear sight until it was a mangled piece of scrap. Then I just stood there, looking at the lifeless husk of metal lying in the mud. It looked so small, so helpless. The others were already moving out, shouting for me to hurry. I felt a pain worse than any wound. I was leaving a part of my soul behind in that frozen mud. I turned and started to run, feeling lighter than I had in years, and emptier than I ever thought possible. I was just a man now, just a scared kid running for his life, trying to get home. And that's the story of the bonesaw. That was my best friend. That was my worst enemy. You don't ever forget something like that. You just learn to live with the ghost of it. You want to know what the war was really like. Not the maps and the arrows and the speeches, but the feeling of it. I'll tell you. It was a sound. One sound more than any other that seared into me, right down in my bones. It wasn't the crump of mortar fire or the crack of a rifle. It was this ripping sound, like God himself was tearing a sheet of canvas right over your head. Fast, so impossibly fast, a dry, metallic brrrrrrrrrp that just didn't seem to take a breath. The Krauts had a machine gun, the MG42, and when that thing opened up, you knew hell had a voice and it was talking directly to you. For the other fellas, the guys in the line, that sound meant get your head down, don't move a muscle, pray to whatever you believe in that the next burst isn't aimed at your foxhole. But for me, for us medics, that sound that was the dreadful bell tolling that meant my work was just about to begin. I'd hear that rip, and a cold dread, colder than any Ardennes morning, would wash right through me. See, that sound meant men were being torn apart. Men I knew. Men I'd maybe just shared a cigarette with, joked about a pin-up girl with, and my job was to go out into that storm. I'd find myself whispering prayers then, but they weren't for my own skin, not really. They were simpler, more desperate pleas. Just stop, please, just for a minute, just stop firing. I wasn't praying to reach cover. I was praying for a ceasefire, a lull, any tiny window of quiet so I could get to the wounded. You'd look down at the red cross on your arm, this bright slash of color against the drab olive of your uniform, and you'd hope. You'd hope that some farm boy from Bavaria or some shopkeeper from Berlin saw it too, and saw it as a plea, not a target. It felt impossibly heavy, that armband. It was supposed to be a shield, but out there in the open, it felt like the biggest target in the world. You were betting your life on a sliver of humanity left in the middle of all that madness. Then you'd hear it, not the gun anymore, but the cries. A gut-wrenching call for medic, or worse, just a high, thin scream that was more animal than man. That's when you moved. There was no heroics to it, no grand charge. It was a crawl. You deheave yourself over the lip of your hole and press yourself into the earth, becoming part of the mud. And you crawled. God, the feel of that ground. Cold, thick mud that sucked at your elbows and knees, hiding sharp stones that would gouge you and worse. You didn't let yourself think about what else was mixed in there. You just crawled, your face so close to the ground you could smell the damp rot of the earth, the tang of explosives, that sharp, bitter smell of cordite that sticks in the back of your throat. Your whole world shrunk down to the few feet of torn-up ground in front of your face, the sound of your own ragged breathing, and that crying voice you were crawling towards. Reaching a wounded man was just the start of the horror. A rifle bullet, it can make a clean hole in and out. But that MG42, it fired so fast the bullets would tumble. They didn't pierce, they shredded. I saw boys with legs that looked like they'd been through a meat grinder, just pulp and splinters of bone. The wounds were terrible, ragged things, and the blood, there was so much of it. The smell would hit you first, that coppery, thick smell of blood mixing with the cordite and the mud. A scent cocktail that I can still catch on the air sometimes even now, 60 years later, and it stops me dead in my tracks. It got on your hands, your uniform, soaked into the wool, and no matter how much you scrubbed later, you felt like you'd never be clean of it. You get your sulfur powder on the wound, your bandages out, trying to stop the bleeding, your hands moving fast but feeling so clumsy and useless against that kind of damage. All the while you're talking to him, saying anything. You're all right, buddy, you're gonna be fine. We'll get you back to the aid station, just hang on. Lying through your teeth because you both knew if the wound was bad enough, he wasn't going to be fine at all. But here's the thing, the part that still gets me. In the middle of all that hell, you'd see these moments, these little flashes of, I don't know, grace, I guess. Humanity. There were times, not always, but sometimes when you'd be out there, that Red Cross clear as day, and the firing would just stop. Not just ours. Theirs too, just for a minute or two. A lull, an unspoken truce. Some German machine gunner up in a nest sees you, a medic, working on a man, and he holds his fire. Maybe the guys on our side see what's happening and they hold theirs too. Nobody said a word. There was no white flag waved. It was just understood. For those few minutes, the war took a breath. It was a fragile, terrifying respect for the one guy out there who wasn't trying to kill anybody. It didn't happen every time, but when it did, it was like a miracle. It meant that somewhere, under the helmet and the uniform, there was still a man. And when you were working on a man, it didn't matter what uniform he wore. I patched up Germans too, when we captured a position and there were wounded left behind. You look in their eyes, and you see the exact same thing you see in a young American kid's eyes. The same fear, the same confusion, the same desperate plea for life. They'd clutch a photograph of their family, a wife, a sweetheart, just like our guys did. They were just boys, scared out of their wits, a long way from home. You do what you can for them because the enemy is the man bleeding in the mud in front of you. The enemy is the wound. The enemy is the war itself. Some of the hardest times weren't even the patching up. It was afterwards, in the relative safety of a dugout or a barn, we'd turned into an aid station. The morphine would kick in and a fella would get quiet and he'd know. He'd know he wasn't going to make it. And he'd ask you, his voice all thin and shaky, "Doc, can you help me write a letter?" And you'd get out a pencil and a scrap of paper, your own hands none too steady, and you'd write down his words. "My dearest Mary," he'd start, and he'd dictate these simple, beautiful, heartbreaking words of love, telling her about the garden back home, about how he missed her apple pie, promising her he wasn't in any pain, which was another lie, but what else could you do? He'd be telling her how much he loved her, how he'd see her again, knowing full well he never would. You de-seal that letter, put it in your pocket, and the weight of it felt heavier than any pack I ever carried. You were carrying a man's last breath, his final wish, and you had to make sure it got sent. I still wonder about those Marys and Susans and Carols, if they ever knew the man who wrote down those words for their husband was shaking just as hard as he was. The exhaustion after a day like that, it wasn't just in your body, though your body was shot. Every muscle ached, you were cold to the core, you could sleep for a week, but it was deeper than that. It was a weariness of the soul. You'd just seen too much. You'd close your eyes and you wouldn't see darkness, you'd see the faces. The faces of the men you saved, sure, you'd try to hold on to those. But it was the others, the ones you couldn't savor their faces, were the ones that came to you in the quiet moments. A kid from Iowa named Jimmy who cried for his mother. An older guy, a sergeant who'd been through North Africa, who just said, "Ah, hell," with a sigh when he saw the wound in his gut, like he was disappointed. Their names, their faces, they're etched into my mind clearer than any photograph. The war ended, we sailed home, had parades, tried to build lives, but those boys never left me. They're still right here. And the sound, the war leaves you with tricks. For years afterwards, a certain kind of silence could be the loudest thing in the world. I'd be sitting on my porch back home, everything peaceful, and a car engine would backfire a street over, and my heart would just about leap out of my chest. But it was the smaller sounds that were the worst. The sound of a piece of cloth tearing, a ripping sound. I'd be helping my wife with the laundry and a sheet would catch and tear a little, and that RRR rip would freeze me solid for a second. Or a big bumblebee buzzing right past your ear, that high-pitched drone. For just a flash, a fraction of a heartbeat, I wouldn't be in my yard. I'd be back in that field, the smell of blood and cordite in my nose, the mud cold beneath my knees, hearing that MG42 tearing the world apart around me, looking for the next man I had to try and save. That's the thing they don't tell you. You can leave the war, but the war doesn't always leave you. It sleeps inside you, and the smallest thing can wake it right up. So that's what it was like. That sound, that damnable ripping sound. It was the sound of my best friend because it told me where I was needed, and it was the sound of my worst enemy because it created the need. And in the quiet of my life now, I can still hear it, a ghost in the machinery, reminding me of the price of it all. You know, they make movies about the noise, the big charges, the shells screaming in. They never get the silence right. That was the real enemy, more than the Russians, more than the mud. The waiting. You'd be crouched down in that ditch they called a trench, the dirt cold and wet against your back, and the world would just stop. It was an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that gets inside your head. A bird would chirp somewhere and your whole body would jolt, your heart hammering against your ribs like it wanted out. Was that a bird? Or was it a signal? You de-stare out into no man's land, into that thick morning mist that clung to the barbed wire, and every shadow would start to move. A shattered tree stump became a crouching soldier, a lump of mud a discarded helmet. Your imagination would play the dirtiest tricks on you, turning nothing into everything. Your fingers would be numb around your rifle, but you couldn't relax your grip, every nerve stretched so tight you thought you might just snap like a piano wire. Time didn't move forward, it just pooled around you, thick and heavy. A single second could feel like an hour, each one a little eternity where you're just waiting for the storm to break, waiting for that sound that defined our whole existence out there. So you had to find ways to trick yourself, to carve out little pockets of something like normal. Me, I'd pull out a sock with a hole in the toe, bigger than my thumb, and I'd fumble with a rusty needle and a bit of frayed thread. My fingers were all clumsy and cold, but there was a strange comfort in it. It was a simple, familiar task. My mother taught me how to darn socks. For a few minutes, I wasn't a soldier in a filthy hole in Russia. I was just a boy mending a sock, concentrating on making a halfway decent stitch. It was a tiny rebellion against the madness. Other times, someone would fish out a precious cigarette, a crushed Golos, or maybe a Lucky if we were lucky. There, DB3 of us, maybe France and little Klaus, and we'd share that one cigarette. No one smoked it for themselves. It was a ritual. You take a deep pull, feeling the hot smoke fill your lungs, and hold it for a second, your eyes closed. And for that one fleeting moment, the world smelled of tobacco instead of rot and cordite. It was a brief, burning luxury that made you feel human again, not just an animal waiting to be slaughtered. Or we'd argue. God, we'd argue about the stupidest things. Was Schock a better team than Dresden? Was Zara Leander a better singer than Marika Rurk? It wasn't about the answers. It was about the noise, about filling that terrible silence with anything, any topic that could pretend we were back in a beer hall in Munich or a cafe in Berlin, that we were just guys shooting the breeze, anyone else, anywhere else. And you held on to things. Not your weapon, that was just a tool. I mean the things you carried close, right next to your skin. I didn't have a picture of a sweetheart. I had one of my little sister, Liesel. She was 12 when I left, with 2 braids and a grin that was missing a front tooth. I'd look at that creased, fading photo, and it wasn't about romance or longing. It was her innocence. That smile had never seen a dead man, never heard the whistle of a mortar. It was a window to a world where the biggest worry was whether there would be pudding after supper. I had a stone, too, just a smooth, grey river stone from the stream behind our house. I'd found it when I was a kid. It fit perfectly in the palm of my hand, cold and smooth. When the fear started to creep up my throat, I'd close my fist around it so tight the edges would press into my skin. It was real, a tangible piece of a peaceful past. It was from a time when stones were for skipping, not for building defensive walls. And in the very bottom of my pack, wrapped in waxed paper, was a single chocolate bar. A real one, Swiss, from a care package. I'd saved it. I told the other guys I was saving it for a special occasion, a victory celebration. But that was a lie we all told ourselves. The truth was, it was for a moment of absolute despair. It was my emergency ration of hope. Knowing it was there, that I had one last taste of sweetness reserved for when I truly, utterly broke, that knowledge alone sometimes kept me going. The worst was when you could feel the tension building in others. We had a new kid, couldn't have been more than 17, fresh off the train from some training depot in Germany where everything was clean and orderly. He was fidgeting, shifting his weight, his gear clinking. Every tiny sound he made was like a gunshot in that silence. Next to me, old Sergeant Hosser, a guy who'd been through Poland and France, he didn't even raise his voice. It was just a low, guttural hiss that cut through the fog. "Be still, boy, be silent, or you'll get us all killed." The kid froze, and you could smell the fear on him, sharp and sour. And then there were the small torments. A mosquito, a single, tiny mosquito, would find its way to your ear. In the middle of all that, this insignificant little insect would start its high-pitched whine. It felt louder than any artillery barrage, a maddening, persistent drone that was focused entirely on you. You want to scream, to swat at it, to do anything to make it stop, but you couldn't move. You just had to lie there and take it, this tiny demon sent to test your sanity. Your jaw would ache from clamping it shut so tight. The waiting became a physical pain, a pressure building behind your eyes. You start to wish for it, you know. You start to pray for something, anything, to happen just to end the unbearable tension of the wait. And then it would come. Not with a single shot, not with a warning. It would just erupt. That sudden, shocking, brutal rip of the MG42. It's a sound you don't just hear with your ears. You feel it in your teeth, in your bones. It's a metallic tearing, like God himself ripping the sky in half. And in that first, terrifying second, amid the chaos and the scrambling and the shouts, there was this tiny, shameful flicker of feeling deep in your gut. It was almost a relief, because the waiting was finally, terribly over. You look young. Too young to be here, in this God-forsaken hole full of mud and the stink of men who haven't washed in a month. I see it in your eyes, that same wide-open look I had when I first got off the truck, all spit and polish from basic, thinking I knew something. You don't know a damn thing, kid, and that's not your fault. But if you want to see your mom again, you'll listen. Not to the officers with their maps and pins, but to me. You listen to the man in the hole next to you, because he's the only one who knows what it's really like out here. The first thing you gotta learn, and learn fast, is to forget your eyes and trust your ears. Your eyes will lie to you, show you shadows and shapes in the fog, but your ears will tell you the truth. They'll keep you alive. You gotta learn the sounds of this place like you learned the sound of your own front door opening back home. There's the crump of a mortar, way off. That's just background noise, like thunder. There's the sharp, lonely crack of a rifle. That's a threat, sure, but it's a single threat. You can deal with that. But then there's the other sound, the one that will freeze the blood in your veins. You'll hear it first as a faint ripping sound, like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half, way off in the distance. That's the MG42. We don't call it a machine gun out here. We call it the buzzsaw, or the zipper, or just plain death. When you hear that rip, that high-pitched tearing sound that's so fast it all blurs together into one long, screaming note, you don't stand up to get a look. You don't peek over the parapet. You get small. You get flat. You press your face into the cold, wet earth, and you become invisible. You pray to whatever you believe in that the guy on the trigger is just firing a harassing burst and not zeroing in on your sector. I've seen it, kid. I've seen a good man named Petey, get up on his knees for 1 second to adjust a sandbag. Just 1 second. That buzzsaw was firing way off, must have been 800 yards away. But the gunner saw the movement, or maybe he just got lucky, and he walked those tracers right into our position. It wasn't like bullets. It was like a hose spraying liquid lead. It chewed up the sandbag, the dirt around it, and Petey, there wasn't much left. The sound is what stays with you. That ripping, and then the sudden, awful silence after the belt runs dry. That's the sound of your life being measured out in seconds. So you listen, always listen. Out here, you learn real fast what matters and what doesn't. All that talk back home about the fatherland, the flag, the grand strategy, it's just noise. It doesn't mean a thing when you're shivering in a foxhole with your buddy Schmidt, sharing a cigarette because the rations are late again. Your country isn't a line on a map anymore. Your country is the man in the hole next to you. It's the guy who will share his last bit of chocolate with you, who will stay awake an extra hour on watch so you can get some shut-eye, who will drag your bleeding body back to the aid station if he can. That's it. That's all there is. And that German boy, the one manning that buzzsaw that we all fear so much, you gotta understand something about him. He's not a monster. He's some farmer's son or some shopkeeper's boy just like you and me. He's scared. He's cold. He's tired. And he fears that MG42 of his too. Not the way we fear it, but he fears it because it's a beacon. It tells every American artillery spotter and mortar crew exactly where he is. When that gun opens up, it's only a matter of time before hell rains down on his position. I've seen it happen. We overran a position once after our artillery had worked it over good. The gunner was still there, a kid, couldn't have been more than 17. He was torn up pretty bad, lying next to that smoking MG42. And you know what he did when he saw me? He didn't curse me or try to fight. He just looked at me with these terrified eyes and he whispered something. I don't speak much German, but it sounded like mutter, mother. He was calling for his mom, same as any of us would. So if we're lucky enough to capture one of those guns, don't you dare celebrate. Don't whoop and holler like you won a prize at a county fair. You just look at it, that piece of finely machined German steel, and you be thankful it's silent. Because you can bet your life its brother is still out there, in the next line of trees, just waiting for you to get careless. It's the little things that'll kill you out here or save you, not the big battles you see in the newsreels. A general can lose a war with a bad decision, but a soldier can lose his life because of a wet sock. You hear me? Keep your feet dry. It sounds stupid, like something your mom would say, but I'm telling you, a blister can turn into trench foot, and trench foot can rot your feet right off if you're not careful, and if you can't walk, you can't run, and if you can't run, you're dead. So you take care of your feet like they're your most prized possession. You change your socks every chance you get, you rub them down, you make sure your boots are as dry as you can get them. And sleep. Sleep is a currency more valuable than dollars. You learn to sleep anywhere, anytime. In the back of a Dusseldorf, bouncing down a rutted road, leaning against a muddy wall, in the bottom of a hole with rain dripping down your collar. You grab it in 5-minute chunks if that's all you can get. Because the war doesn't care if you're so tired you're seeing double. The buzzsaw doesn't care if you've been up for 2 days straight. It'll cut you in half just the same. And food. Eat when you can, whatever you can. That cold Croatian stew might taste like garbage, but you eat it. You never know when the supply line will get cut, and you'll be living on a handful of hardtack and the water in your canteen for 3 days. I remember one time, we'd been pinned down for hours, and finally there was a lull. We were all just lying there, too exhausted to move. And I saw a dandelion, a bright yellow dandelion, growing right through a crack in the cobblestones of what used to be somebody's kitchen. I just stared at it. For a minute I wasn't in the war. I was back in my mom's garden, a kid again, with no worries bigger than a skinned knee. You find those moments, you cling to them, and the letters, you gotta write letters. It's a rope thrown back to the world, to who you used to be. But here's a piece of advice my first sergeant gave me, and it was good advice. Don't send the sad ones. You'll write letters when you're scared, when you're homesick, when you've just seen your friend die. You'll pour all that fear and misery onto the page, and it'll feel good to get it out. But then you take that letter and you don't mail it. You keep it. You write another one the next day when you're feeling a little stronger. You tell them about the funny thing your buddy said, or how you saw a beautiful sunrise, or how you're sure this will all be over soon. You give them the hope that you're desperately trying to feel yourself. Because they can't help you out here, and worrying them to death back home isn't going to change a thing. You're going to be scared. Don't let anyone tell you different. Every man out here is scared, from the greenest replacement to the old-timer who's been fighting since Africa. The ones who say they aren't scared are either lying or they're crazy, and you don't want to be near either. Courage, it ain't what you think. It's not some grand feeling like in the movies. It's just doing your job. It's standing up and firing your rifle when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to stay down. It's crawling forward with a satchel charge when you know that buzzsaw is just waiting for a target. It's being terrified, pissy-uppance terrified, and still doing what needs to be done because the guy next to you is counting on you. That's all it is. And you have to find a way to keep your soul through all of this. This place, it tries to grind you down into nothing, into just a thing that shoots and eats and sleeps. You have to fight back. You have to find a small piece of beauty every day, even if it's just for a second. It might be the way the morning mist hangs over the fields, making the whole world quiet and peaceful for a few minutes before the shooting starts. It might be the taste of a real apple that a farmer gave you, the sweetest thing you've tasted in months. It might be the sound of the guys singing a quiet song at night, all of us together, our voices soft under the stars. You grab those moments and you hold them tight. They're your armor. And you hold on to the thought of home. Not the big, abstract idea of home, but the little details. The smell of your mom's cooking, the feel of your own bed, the sound of your kid brother laughing. You keep that picture in your head and you promise yourself you'll see it again. And if you're one of the lucky ones, If you make it through this hell and you get to go home, you have to do the hardest thing of all. You have to leave the war here. Can't bring it back with you. You'll want to. It'll be stuck to you like the mud on your boots. You'll jump at the backfire of a car. You'll wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that ripping sound in your dreams. You'll look at people going about their normal lives, buying groceries, going to the movies, and you'll want to scream at them, "Don't you know what's happening? Don't you know what I've seen?" But they don't. And they shouldn't. That's the whole point of you being here, so they can have that normal life. So you have to try. You have to let it go. You have to let the buzzsaw rest in these fields. Don't let it keep screaming in your head for the next 50 years. It's earned its silence. And you've earned your peace. So you go home, you kiss your girl, you get a job, you have a family, you live, really live. That's the best way to honor the guys who didn't make it. You live a good life for them. Now here, it's getting dark and it's gonna get cold. Take my extra blanket and remember what I told you. Keep your head down and your ears open. Welcome to the front, kid. Just do your best to stay alive.